Okay, calm down.
You have a politician in our president who, I mean, leaving aside his various deficiencies, current deficiencies, I'm speaking as diplomatically as I can, is a deep-dyed believer in Israel is always right. I mean, he's always believed this. He was proselytized by Golda herself. And she was a very, very persuasive woman. She was a spellbinding figure. You look at her picture and say, she doesn't really look very impressive, but she was enormously impressive, enormously impressive. She worked on him. She was the first person to work on him. And he's been, under that kind of, also check it out. Type in Joe Biden AIPAC money. And he is the largest single recipient of money from AIPAC and Israel-related lobbies in American history from 1990 until today.
Wow.
I'm sure that had nothing to do with his views. But, you have a president who's chosen people around him who obviously reflect his views, which are troglodyte views. I mean, they're views that formed in the 1960s where Israel was a miracle, made the desert bloom. It's perfect. And he believes that. He literally believes, not only believes everything they say, he repeats everything they say. Admiral Daniel Hagari, the spokesman, has said very few things that Joe Biden has not actually repeated word for word. And if he didn't repeat it, the hacks who speak for him, Admiral Kirby and these other folks, repeated them. So, and they're master's voice. They're repeating what Biden wants repeated. So you have people who basically believe Israel can do no wrong in the White House.
That's my fear and why I was kind of questioning the suicidal nature of Israel, because, I mean, fingers crossed it does end that project, right? And maybe it's going to take a long time, but my fear is that given the unending, undying support of the West, it doesn't matter about, it does, to some extent, how much does public opinion shift matter?
I want to correct something you just said, because the undying support of the Western elites
political and media
is one thing.
Yes, yeah.
The undying support of the West is another thing. If you go back to Woodrow Wilson, or you go back to Balfour, in other words, post-World War I, the idea of Zionism had the support of Western publics.
Right.
It didn't just have the support of elites. And there are different reasons for that. It's not important. And that was true from the beginning of Zionism, I would argue, or soon after, right up until quite recently, a decade or two ago. You had public opinion supportive of Israel. I mean, every poll I've ever seen said that. It's not true anymore, but it was true up until a few years ago. And it still is true for people my age and 20 years younger than me. Overwhelming support for Israel among much older people. That's changing with the younger generation. So Israel no longer has the support of the West. If you by that you mean the people in these supposed democracies. If you mean the wall-to-wall elites, yes, that has not changed one bit.
Right.
There you're right.
I know that people, I keep, to keep hope personally, I look and I see the public opinion shift, and I see it not having an immediate impact on our elites. But then I think, well, historically, you're never going to have the shift at the elite level without this stuff happening at the bottom.
Well, I'm going to make two parallels, or a couple parallels that are not really terribly accurate, but I'm going to make them anyway. Think about how the anti-war movement in the 60s eventually changed public opinion. I mean, body bags and mainstream media being allowed on the battlefield, which the Army eventually stopped allowing, changed public opinion. And it was overwhelmingly anti-war long before either the Johnson administration or the Nixon administration stopped the war. It took the better part of a decade from the beginning of the shift in public opinion to the end of the war in '75. Same was true with the Iraq War. Bush was reelected in '04 with a majority of the popular vote, because up to that point, the war was popular. If you look at public opinion polls, literally for the months after November 9, 2004, support for the war declines. And the war went on for another 7 years, or 6, depending on how you count it. I'm talking about the Iraq War. So it takes a long time before the people can force their rulers to change the policies that they're bent on. And I would argue this is going to be even harder in many ways. We do not have a draft. American soldiers are not fighting. They're involved, but they're not fighting. They're involved intimately in targeting, in tracking, in intelligence, in air defense, in many things. There are American military presence is involved in the war, but they're not boots on the ground doing the actual combat. And so that's one factor you cannot look at when you compare to Vietnam or Iraq.
Right.
And there are others, obviously.
There's a kind of wag the dog debate that, to oversimplify, I'll just say is, on the one hand, you have the Mearsheimer thesis, which is that it's the Israel lobby controlling the United States and forces it to act against its own interests. And then you have the other, I mean, Chomskyan or many other people say it's the United States using Israel as a pawn for its own national interests. So where do you fall on that?
I have argued very extensively in several books that I've written that when American leaders deduce that there is something that Israel is doing that is not in the American national interest, they force Israel to do what they want. Obama did that with the nuclear deal with Iran. Netanyahu spoke twice before joint sessions of Congress to try and derail what the president was doing or had done, and he failed. It was decided, I can tell you what the military thinks. The military thinks the United States cannot win a war with Iran. And so they said, what are our alternatives? Let's take the deal. It was a great deal. Should have been allowed to continue. And there are multiple instances, from President Eisenhower through President Bush Sr. to, I could go on and on and on. Reagan with the phone call to Begin. Kissinger and Nixon and Ford, forcing Israel into disengagement agreements. They kicked, they screamed, they fought. And the Americans said to them, we don't care what you say. We're going to win the Cold War. We win Egypt. We don't care about you. We defeat the Soviets in the Middle East. Israel is small change. We don't care. You will do what we say. So when selling arms to Saudi Arabia, I could go on and on and on. So it's absolutely not true that where what are perceived in Washington as vital interests are at stake, money, oil, winning the Cold War, whatever it may be, not fighting a war with Iran, American presidents have no compunction, or have had. I mean, this one might be an exception in Trump, but with those two possible exceptions, American presidents have had no compunction about telling the Israelis to get off, where to get off. So I disagree with the Mearsheimer thesis in that respect. However, he's right about one thing. Where Palestine is concerned, no vital American interests are perceived to be at stake. There are jackboot military dictatorships and the most absolute monarchies since Louis XIV who are completely under the American thumb. They will keep the people down. We don't care, therefore, about the Arabs because we have Arab regimes that are more American and Israeli than they are Arab. And so in Washington, there's no negative impact from blanket support for Israel where Palestine is concerned. Where critical American interests are concerned, as these people perceive them, they'll stop the Israelis cold. Right. And they have done it again and again. I'm not sure about this fellow, Biden. In fact, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't and hasn't. I think this has gone beyond the point of harming American interests. I think it's done irreparable damage to the United States. And I don't think this president sees that.
You, I know, have said publicly, including on my show, that you wouldn't vote for Joe Biden. Of course, you're in New York, so what are your thoughts now that he's been replaced by Kamala Harris? And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you have any ideas about how different a Trump presidency would be from a Harris presidency vis-a-vis Palestine?
Yeah. First of all, any one of you who, like me, is registered in this state was disenfranchised by a bunch of old men wearing white wigs in the 18th century as a result of our backwards slaveholder-written constitution. We have no voice in the presidential election. People in red states and blue states, we don't count. And that's a disgrace. So my vote, your vote, anybody who's not registered in one of the battleground states does not have effectively doesn't have a vote in the presidential election. We might as well go out and die. Doesn't matter. We don't count. So that's the first thing. So my vote doesn't count. Doesn't matter what I say in this presidential level. I think you can say two things one thing about Trump and one thing about Harris. I see absolutely no reason to believe from anything she's said or done that Harris will do anything different from Biden. I don't think she had the same exact brainwashing he did. She's much younger than him. So her brainwashing was brainwashing light.
Better language.
Yeah.
Less offensive.
She's also more in touch You know, from the heights of the Democratic Party nomenclatura, she looks down and sees slightly more clearly than Biden, who barely can see. The people in the 20s, 30s, and 40s who make up the bulk of the Democratic Party's actual constituency. And she understands that they are very unhappy. The overwhelming majority of Democrats, if they had a choice, would stop the war yesterday. Overwhelming majority. And she knows that. But she's part of the nomenclatura, and I don't expect dramatic changes. Now, I know that Netanyahu expects changes if she is elected, and is very worried about that. I don't care about Netanyahu. That's my reading. It'll be Joe Biden light, probably. Trump, the thing about Trump, you have to say, whether it's about this or anything else, is he's utterly unpredictable. And he's probably losing it. So a lot depends, I don't know about that, but he seems to be, a little bit. And that's just an impression. But it is clear that if he decides to do something, he can do almost anything. And the people around him might try and stop him. But if you read what almost every single person who was around him during his first and hopefully only term in office said, they didn't have very much influence on him. Now, maybe he'll pick a bunch of complete nut jobs this time, rather than the group that he had around him in his national security team. And they will go whichever way he goes. So I don't think you can predict anything. I don't think he wants the United States to be directly involved in a Middle Eastern war. I think that's pretty clear. But I think that's true of the entire American elite. I think they, in their stupid, slow way, have learned the lessons of Afghanistan and Iraq, that it's maybe not politically a very good thing for you as a politician to send a lot of Americans to be killed in the mountains of Afghanistan or the deserts of Iraq or in Palestine or Iran or anywhere else. So I don't think he, or for that matter, Harris, will necessarily get us into a direct involvement in a ground war in which American troops would be involved. The United States is fighting in this war, and I don't think either would do much different, frankly.
You don't have to answer this, but if you want to, who are you voting for?
I'm not going to answer that.
Are you going to vote?
I always vote.
Okay. I would say we have no power to vote. I would say the power we have is to vote with our consciences as not being in swing states. So, which will not be Harris for me, or Trump.
I won't vote for either of them
Okay.
either. That for sure.